After an illustrious career in archaeology, Dr. Henry Jones Jr. retires, but not before getting in the saddle for one last adventure. Is it the final triumph or massive dud? Find out when Johnnie Torch reviews Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Well, welcome into another Johnnie Torch Reviews. We're having a enjoyable 4th of July weekend, and what better way to spend it than with an American icon, Indiana Jones? So, this is a pretty early review for me. Usually, I don't see these movies on the opening weekend, but there's just something about Indiana Jones that won't be denied. And I had to be there and make sure I seen it before all kinds of spoilers came out. A lot of people were critical of this from the very beginning because, of course, of Harrison Ford's advanced age for an action role like this. He was not quite 80 when he was filming it, but he's 80 years old now. People say, well, he's 80. Actually, the character is only 70 in this movie because it's set in 1969, which canonically Indiana Jones was born 1899. So that makes him about 70 years old. And we're going to talk about it first without any spoilers. So let me get straight to it. First, a little background like I like to do. Of course, I'm a big Indiana Jones fan. I was there almost from the beginning. I saw Raiders on VHS first as a kid, and went to see Temple of Doom in the theater. Of course, Last Crusade. Loved all three. My favorite, if I was going to rank them, would have to be, of course, the original three. Nothing's really going to touch them. I didn't go into this one expecting this one to be as good as the original three, but of course, I would say Raiders, Last Crusade, and then Temple of Doom. But I love all of them pretty equally. I mean, only by the slightest of varying degrees could I really separate them. Then came Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and I was one of, I don't want to say the few that really enjoyed that film, because there's been some kind of revision of history. Because I remember when it came out, it was a big hit with critics. It was a big hit mostly with fans. I mean, I would say maybe 70-30, something like that. Fans approved of it. It had its issues. It was clearly, up until this film, the weakest of the saga, but it was I always go back to what Steven Spielberg said. He said he wanted it to be a blood relative of the original three, meaning it did feel in keeping with the original three, the themes, the way they pretty much carried on through, with a certain expectations of Indy fighting a guy bigger than him, or the MacGuffin being something that was too much for Indy to control, and in most cases, he didn't leave with it. It felt kind of like in that vein, and I didn't really feel any disappointment with that. We're going to compare the Dial of Destiny with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull a little more in a few minutes when we get into the spoiler section. But right now, just for my top of my head, off the cuff review with no spoilers, I'm going to say I I didn't really enjoy this film all that much. I had several problems with it, and I'm not going to say I hated it. The thing that I think a lot of people were afraid of was comparing this to, say, The Last Jedi. I don't think they Last Jedi Luke Indy in this. I think that there are some problems that the film has. And again, I think it's mostly because this is the first one without Lucas and Spielberg. You don't really get that flavor quite as much, except for the beginning with the de-aging scene, and we'll get to that more in a minute too. But just as a brief review, I I I I just felt like there was something lacking, and it wasn't necessarily due to Ford's age, and it wasn't necessarily due to the MacGuffin, which was interesting, although probably I don't know. I think maybe it was a better MacGuffin than the Crystal Skull, but it was probably one of the weaker ones. I mean, the the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant is kind of tough acts to follow. But I think they tried. They tried here. And I think basically if I was to sum up the picture, I would say they tried. I think they tried to evoke pretty much everything from every film, and they didn't quite get there a lot of times, but they still tried, and I kind of appreciate that they tried. Wasn't a huge fan of Phoebe Waller-Bridge, of her character in this. I do feel that they kind of Ray Skywalkered her a little bit. I don't think as badly, but I think there was some hints of that, some elements of that. Um, she kind of had to carry the picture by necessity, considering Ford's age, and I that was something I didn't like, and that was something we'll get into in detail in a moment. The characters, I mean, there's a few other characters here. The villain, again, he's kind of underwhelming. He's almost like this is Mads Mikkelsen's character. Um, what's his name? I got the names here in front of me, so I don't have to keep saying what's his name in the film. But Doctor Voller. He comes off a lot like Kate Blanchett's character, where they're kind of imposing, but you don't really feel. I don't know. There seems to be some kind of lacking for the seething hatred. You know what I mean? I think they tried to give that to Boyd Holbrook's character. He was kind of supposed to be the tote. He was the guy you really hate and you kind of want. This was a guy that was just ambitious, kind of like I guess maybe in the mold of I guess they were trying to make him sort of like a Donovan or a Belloc. Again, he kind of paled compared to both of those. But yeah, they had some decent action scenes that were callbacks to kind of like what we would expect. Like there's a what do they call that? A putt putt or something, the chase in the streets of Morocco or something, and that kind of evokes the sidecar chase in Last Crusade or the motorcycle chase in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. They have some, they did do a couple of things that, again, not to go too far into spoilers, that kind of evoked the original films. But yeah, to me, this is the least of the Indiana Jones films. This is the most lacking. Like I said, they didn't outright embarrass Indy, a la Jake Skywalker, but they kind of took him down a path that was a bit unusual for him. And a lot of people will make the excuse, well, it's his age and this and that. I still felt like it felt like Indy, but I kind of felt that Indy at this age would have been a little different than he acted, and I think it was due to they kind of pushed they did push a little too much into the depressed Indy vein. I think in this, we'll get to that a little bit later. So again, not a glorious review, but I suppose I would say, would I recommend it? I think if you're a diehard Indiana Jones fan, you do have to see it. I mean, I would see this in theaters, knowing what I know about it, just to see, of course, John Williams' score. He scored this picture beautifully. There was some nods to different uh periods, like I heard like some little things that evoked Raiders, some things that evoked Temple of Doom. There was like he just did another masterful scoring on this film. And again, this may well be his last scoring for a film. I think he said that a couple of times now. I'm not sure if he ever will decide to really retire, but God bless him. He's done a wonderful job, and we're so lucky to have him, especially in this film. It really, because in this day and age, the score is not what it used to be. Basically, back in the day, we had a handful of good theme composers and so forth. John Williams, of course, always head and shoulders above all of them. And even to this day, the score is like it's a character unto itself that no other composer really does. I mean, you might hear a song in a picture, an action movie, like a superhero movie or something. You say that's the hero's theme. Ah, yeah, that's nice. But he imbues the film itself with character. And that's something, again, that no other composer, I don't think, does in the present day, if ever, to the level John Williams did. So, again, hats off to him most of all. Just great work there. Of course, Harrison Ford gives his best. I think the performances were good. Harrison Ford again as Indiana Jones for the final time. Like I said, who wouldn't want to see that? And like I said, if this was the case, like the Last Jedi, where I felt like they had embarrassed the character and it didn't feel like Indiana Jones, then maybe I would hold my, you know, telling you to hold my recommendation. But as it stands, I would say you should go see it. I can't think of a numerical rating right this second. I think I'm going to save that for the end. So maybe if you want to click on the last 10 minutes, maybe for that. But we're going to get into the spoilers now. Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. So you got 10 minutes of me talking about it without spoilers. Now here's the spoilers. Okay, so again, I don't think it's a spoiler really to say, but all the pundits or whatever that were trying to say that this is going to happen and Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character is going to take over for Ford and be the next Indiana Jones, and she's going to put on the hat and go back in time and find the Ark and find the Holy Grail and the Shankara stones. All that turned out to be nonsense, like I knew it was. Why do people listen to these YouTube hosts that just deal in rumor and it's all fabrication and they just hide behind it because they're like, well, they had 7 different endings and they shot them all and they showed test audience. They didn't shoot 7 different endings. You go back for reshoots and you tweak a couple of things. You don't shoot a different ending, or if you do, it usually makes the reliable news sources because that takes quite a lot to reshoot. They didn't reshoot her taking over Indy's role in Raiders or something. It's just ridiculous. That didn't really sound like anything more than fan fiction anyway. But let's see. So we start off. Let's talk about the prologue. Of course, there's always a prologue in an Indiana Jones movie, and it's always usually really good. And this one was really good as well. The de-aging technology, yeah, it's not quite there yet. I thought it was really good. Of course, it was a lot of it in the dark, so they kind of hedged their bets there. But I think that's the wave of the future. A lot of people complain about it. I think it's here to stay. I mean, I don't really have a problem with it as long as it's used well. Like I said, there's a few scenes. Basically, when he's in motion, it's you can kind of tell the face is kind of moving a little unnaturally to match up with the actor that's playing, which I guess is really Ford. He really played, his own character, Indiana Jones, in the flashbacks as well. And it was really fun. It was going back to the 40s. That's something that I thought was interesting. That they didn't show the date, as far as I know. They didn't say 1944, I think it was, or it was at the end of the war, and India's undercover again, which is always great to see him. I mean, it's not great to see him in a Nazi uniform, but he's going, up against the Nazis, and he's undercover, and it's like really exciting. And we get, of course, we've got to have like a Nazi baddie who was uh, played by a familiar looking actor. I can't remember his name, but I think was he in Age of Ultron, because he seemed familiar to me. I'm not sure, but he was a pretty good heavy for being the protagonist. I mean, the antagonist of the prologue, and they're going after the Holy Lance, which I thought was really exciting because since they're doing something that's like less of a religious artifact, a lot of people, like I said, poo-pooed the crystal skulls, and I agreed that that was one of the weaker MacGuffins. But the lance that pierced the side of Christ, that of course sounds like a really exciting object that you would want to try to have Indiana Jones go after. Now, on the one hand, I don't really know what, and again, they could say anything, what powers the Holy Lance would have. That's what made it difficult to make that, I think, the full MacGuffin for the movie. I was hoping that it was going to be some kind of, compartment, so to speak, of the Dial of Destiny. Like, for instance, we had the headpiece to the Staff of Ra leading us to, the Ark. And I thought maybe this would come into play later. But unfortunately, it really doesn't have anything to do with it. It was nice that they shouted out, but it was a forgery. And I guess it was kind of interesting to see Indy go after something as well that wasn't authentic, because there are such things, in life, that there is forgeries of some of these things. And I would have liked, they have the Basil, the sidekick here in the prologue, at least, where he's like saying, well, we just wanted it to go after a important historical artifact, and that maybe that the Holy Lance doesn't in fact have powers, because I really don't know what powers it would have, you know what I mean, but it did touch the blood of Christ, and you would think that that would somehow, cause it to be more special than just the average, artifact. So again, I thought the scene was really good, and you get a lot of action, and I think this scene played out a little bit longer than the average. I'm trying to think, maybe not. I think they all are about like 15 minutes. This was maybe 20. Maybe, I don't know, but it didn't feel too lengthy. But in a sense, this was the Indiana Jones picture. You know, what I mean, I kind of feel like this was the apology, and they put it up front. It was like, you're not going to get quite the Indiana Jones of the past in this movie, so we're going to give you as much of him as possible in the prologue. And we're going to hope that you enjoy it, so that when the second half, or, when the real picture starts, you're not going to hold it against us that we really didn't give you the full Indiana Jones experience, because they really don't after this. And it was fun. I enjoyed the prologue a lot. And you see him going on the top of a train, which is something we really didn't get in the Indiana Jones movies. I know we got it in the prologue of Last Crusade, but I mean, as an adult indie, I think it was fun to see him in that setting, because we've seen him on ships, we've seen him, in car and truck chases and whatever, but we really never seen adult indie on a train in an action scene. So I really like that. I really like that. All right, so then let's get back to the future, or at least the past, future, present of Indiana Jones in 1969, where all kinds of activities going on, because the moon landing just happened. If you believe in that sort of thing, it would have been interesting if he said that then at that point. But I know a lot of people don't believe that now, but I do believe it. So we see. I guess there was a different museum curator or whoever, because he wasn't working for Marshall College, I don't think, at this point. Jim Broadbent, I think, was the name of the last actor who played the Marcus Brody role. Of course, the great Denham Elliott passed on shortly after Last Crusade, I think 2 or 3 years after that film, because he did look kind of rough back then in that film. And he gets killed pretty unceremoniously. I hope, it's just, there is a huge body count in this film, but it seems like it's mostly like inconsequential. That's kind of a strange feeling I had about it. And so Indy's retiring. He's about 70 years old. He's teaching kids that, and I didn't really have a problem with this. He's teaching kids that really don't care anymore. And I think this is supposed to speak to how the 60s kind of killed the adventurous spirit, if not the 60s, definitely by the 70s. I mean, the 60s were a different type of adventurous thing. It was, we're going to the moon and the space race and all this and that, but people weren't, or kids, I guess, college age or whatever, weren't thrilled and excited over the prospect of digging up parts of Rome and Egypt and, finding out about the past. It was more of a race to the future, and I think that kind of captured that pretty good. I thought that was all right. And we kind of see like a grumpier old indie, because they're playing the Beatles next door, and the kids are all hippies or whatever, and he's like, turn down that music. Again, I you have to remember the situation here. It's again, he's kind of a man out of his element now at this point in his career, and I didn't mind too much of that. What I did mind is they, saying it right up front, they had him separated from Marion. They had Mutt die, Mutt Williams slash Henry Jones the third. Now, from what I understand, I think it was always the plan not to have Mutt Williams in the film, because for some reason people didn't respond well to Shia LaBeouf as Indy's son. I thought he was fine. I thought he was playing a good approximation of what like a 50s kid would be, a greaser, and he was fine. And, people that complain about the Crystal Skull always have the same complaints. It's nuking the fridge and it's him swinging on vines with the monkeys. Nuking the fridge was fine. There was nothing really wrong with that scene. The swinging on the vines with monkeys was literally a minute, if not 90 seconds of the movie. I mean, I don't think that went on for too long. I don't really know why that bothered people so much. I mean, it wasn't great, yeah, but I mean, did it really affect your whole experience? I don't know why people complain about that. So I kind of knew from the beginning that Mutt was going to be out. Of course, he was killed in the war, in the Vietnam War, and subsequently Marion leaves because there's like tension between them. Because we hear later on in the film, and this is kind of jumping around. I know this, I do this a lot, but jumping around, when he's on the boat later on, he talks about how, Marion couldn't get over the death of Mutt, and how Mutt sort of enlisted against Indy's wishes. And this is kind of the thing that bothered me. Now, again, comparing it to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, one of the lines that always comes back from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, that I think whether you love the movie or hate the movie, everybody liked this element when, as we said, Jim Broadbent, I think the curator that was taking over for Marcus, he says a line that everybody liked, which was, "We're at the age now where life stops giving us things and they start taking things away from us." Because Indy was going through a little bit of a rough time at this point, where he says it's been a rough few years. First, he lost his father, Sean Connery, Henry Jones, and then he lost Marcus. So again, his fathers and father figures, so to speak, are all leaving him, and now he's at the point where he has to sort of face that he's the wise old man. And I love that about the movie. They don't dwell really on the depression of that. They just make it clear that he is moving on to another point in his life. Another chapter is opening up. He thinks he might be done teaching. Obviously not. And that was what was so great about the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, is the resolution in that is that life had not stopped giving him things. Life doesn't always stop giving us things, because he did reconnect with Marion. He got that love back, and that was the love of his life. And he got a son in the process that he didn't know he had. And that leaves the saga on so much more of a happier note than what we go through here. It reminds me also of like Star Trek 3, where they introduced Kirk's son in Star Trek 2 only to kill him off in the next movie. And it feels, and there was reasons for it thematically. It had to be, well, he had to lose something in order to try to gain Spock back from the dead, and it couldn't be that easy for him to just go pick him up and bring him back to Starfleet. And yeah, he's back. It had to be, well, he lost his ship, he lost his son, he may never get a captain's seat again. And I don't feel that even this movie justified Mutt's death as much as Star Trek 3 justified David's death. I hate it when they sort of just put this, in as a, well, this is what happened and you got to deal with it. It doesn't really serve any thematic purpose other than, like I said, undoing the happy ending of Crystal Skull. We actually had a lot of great endings for Indiana Jones that were all happy. I mean, if we're doing this chronologically, it's supposed to be Temple of Doom is first. And that's arguably the happiest ending. I mean, he's brought back this whole village of children from slavery, and everybody's happy, and everybody's, they just are so happy to see their kids, and the village is back to life. And, he's not going to wind up with Willie, but, at least there's a kiss, and, short rounds there. Everybody's happy. Then, of course, you get the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he's reconnected with Marion the first time, and he's going off arm in arm with Marion, and you think that there's going to be some kind of, relationship with them. Then you go to Last Crusade, and, I was surprised at that point that, he wasn't going to ever get back with Marion, but he apparently didn't. So the happy ending was that he rides off into the sunset. Everybody loved that ending, with his father, with Sala, with Marcus. And it's just like the guy's riding off into the sunset for the next adventure. In Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he gets married. He gets married to Marion, the love of his life. And he has a son now. He has an heir, someone to take over for him. And he won't let his son take the hat yet because he's not quite done. But someday he'll get it, but he's not ready yet to just pass that torch. And again, see, all these films ended with such a happy ending, but in this film, it kind of soured me on no matter which way it was going to end, Mutt wasn't going to come back. Now, going back to that scene on the boat, I felt like when he was talking about that, and Helena Shaw, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, when she's telling him, "What would you do if you could, go back in time?" And he says, "I would stop him from joining the service and tell him he's going to die." And I kind of thought, even before I went into the picture, I thought that that was kind of what they were going to do, that they were actually going to have him try to alter his past, because he's going to try to stop the Nazis, of course, from taking over, from using the Dial of Destiny, but that he would try to alter his own past so that his son wouldn't die. And that they wouldn't have to even bring back Shia LaBeouf, that maybe that would just say, on his letter that he got that said, your son was killed in action, that would disappear. And instead he would get a letter that would say, "Oh, hi, Dad, I'm coming home for, Christmas," or whatever. You know what I mean? But they really don't get that really sentimental, happy ending that I think Spielberg would have given us and Lucas would have liked to have given us. I think that they would probably have done that. And that's one of the things that I was disappointed on. And I think part of the problem is, well, let's I don't want to get straight to the end because we've got a lot of movie to cover before we get to the end, and I'm getting way ahead of myself with that. But all right, so let's get back to where he was in retiring and the big parade scene. I thought that for some reason it felt like a lot of people are talking about the movie was too long, and I think this portion of the movie was what I would trim a lot out of. I think the rest of it flowed relatively well. Some of the action scenes you can argue was a little long. I'd have to see it again to really think that, because I think a lot of times I go back and watch action scenes and I say, nah, that wasn't too bad. But I think this build up here, where they're trying to say that Indy, they frame him for murder or something, and they are trying to say that it's kind of a story that goes nowhere. And they probably could have cut that out and just sort of reworked it, because they they have, all right, Helena Shaw, Phoebe Waller-Bridge comes into it. It's his goddaughter, and she's trying to tell him all about this, about the Dial of Destiny that her father wanted, and we get most of that story already out as it is. And he is, he's not interested in it. He doesn't want to get into it, but he has the piece of that her father entrusted to him still. And that flashback, they have a flashback later on showing when he actually entrusted it to her, to Indy. That CGI I thought looked a lot better, because it didn't really rely on trying to make Harrison Ford look 30 again, or 35, whatever it was. It just kind of looked de-aged to the point of, whatever Ford was supposed to be at that point. I don't know, 50s, 55, somewhere like that. And so he's not sold on this whole thing, but I think the adding of the, you know, murder plot or whatever that was that they framed him, that really didn't add anything to it. That I think they could have proceeded on with the picture without that. That kind of slowed things down. It didn't really make any sense. Now that we get the action scene, first we get the introduction to the doctor, Mads Mikkelsen. And this also I think could have been cut. It's like there's this like 5-minute scene where they're sort of setting up that he's a villain. He's working for NASA now, like a lot of, I guess, former Nazis did, and they used whatever technology that they were learning under Hitler's regime, and imparted to the Americans. This is all history, of course. But he has, higher aspirations. He tells the guy, the waiter that comes in, a black waiter, and he says, you didn't win the war, Hitler lost it. So he's got aspirations of being able to correct what Hitler did wrong in World War II. And I thought this scene was like pretty much unnecessary, because it was, this is what I think, if anybody wanted to point to something being woke, I guess was this, because he's basically just um trying to instigate, some kind of hostility with this waiter, you know what I mean? And he's like, what has your country done for you? And this and that. And it's like, all right, we know he's a bad guy. We know Nazis hate, everybody that's not like them. We really don't need this extra 5 minutes of him um trying to get the goat of this black waiter. You know what I mean? It's kind of the thing that could have been trimmed out. A lot of this early buildup, I think, was unnecessary or could have been trimmed down to the bare essentials. Then there's the action scene. Indy gets into the parade and then he gets on a police horse. And I felt like this was my big objection to the handling of the Indy character in this film, which is all right. Indy is older now. Like I said, he's supposed to be 70. Harrison Ford's 80. And Harrison Ford looks great, by the way. I mean, God willing, I look as good as he does at 80. I just hope so. I hope I make it. But I expected more of Indy even at that age. Now I know he wasn't going to get into a fist fight with a guy twice his size. They actually have a guy twice his size in this film to sort of try to tempt you into remembering the days when he could take on guys that big. And I didn't expect him to whip across a chasm and swing. I didn't expect him to like jump on the back of a truck and hang from his whip. But I was expecting more than what we got. We got him on the horse, which again was kind of evocative of Raiders and Last Crusade. But he seems like he's out of his element. He seems like he just barely gets by. And I'm like, well, for an Indiana Jones picture, I really want to see him be a little more proactive, a little more that he can handle himself even at 70 years old. Because I mean, let's look at again, I don't know if this is spoilers or if people are interested in the Flash, but going back to what they did with Michael Keaton's Batman. Now, Michael Keaton is like 72 or something like that. So he was like 70 when he did the Flash. And they didn't make that an issue at all. He just puts the costume back on and he can do everything. Now, to their defense, he didn't say how old he was, Batman. Now, Keaton again, he's also pretty well preserved for his age. He could pass for I don't know 60 or like 10 years younger as well. So, all right, maybe that's a bit of an age difference, but to me, I think they could have done a little bit better in showing Indy handling himself. Now, starting with this parade scene, Indy gets kidnapped. Well, actually, probably going back to the prologue, he does. But I mean, Indy gets kidnapped and captured about a half a dozen times in this film. And he doesn't do very well getting out of that scrape. It seems like that to me, he wasn't proactive enough. Um, like for instance, again, we may be jumping around a bit, but we like there's the scene on the boat, Antonio Banderas' boat. Ronaldo, I think was his name. And it was fun seeing Antonio Banderas in it. I'll get a little bit more into the characters later because Sala comes back as well, and we get into some of those things in a few moments. But I'm talking more about the issues now that I have with it. Was like, for instance, in the boat, there's a scene where the bad guys capture them again, and Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Helena, has a stick of dynamite in her pocket, and she's trying to sort of bluff her way past the villains, and she's telling them kind of sort of the truth of interpreting the code on the disc or whatever that thing was. And basically, Indy has nothing to do with getting out of any of these scrapes. It's always just him sort of, he elbows his way out of the way when something happens and then he gets away. And what I would have liked to have seen was that he was the one that had the initiative to get the dynamite stick and she could take the cigarette and he would try to, you know, I kind of wanted to see him do more. And there was like too many things that they put on Helena because she was the young assistant that was taking away from Indiana Jones. It felt to me like Indiana Jones was the sidekick, and a lot of people I think were expecting that, and to some extent it's true. Now, another thing I think didn't work very well was they had her be as smart as him when it came to the dial. What Indy works best at when he works best is when he has a sidekick that's not, I don't want to say not too bright, but is not as smart as him. Sala didn't really know nothing about archaeology. I mean, he was on point when it came to, well, the Nazis are digging over there and they found a map room. He was smart, but I mean, he didn't know anything about what the Ark was about. Ditto, like, Short Round and Willie. He had to explain to them the purpose of the stones, the Shankara stones. In The Last Crusade, his father was, as well versed in the Grail legend, but again, it all falled on Indy's shoulders to sort of figure out what was what and what he had to do in the cave with the swinging pendulum and stuff with the buzzsaw. I kind of felt like that some of that was missing. I think when the film felt the most like Indiana Jones was when they get into the cave near the end there, and he's the one that understands what Archimedes was trying to do, and he puts the levers in the right position or whatever, and that felt very much like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The thing that reminded me of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that I didn't like, because it was the same here as it was in Crystal Skull, is I felt the lead up to the MacGuffin was boring. That doesn't really happen in the classic ones. But they made it kind of boring and academic in Crystal Skull, and it felt boring and academic here. Like, for instance, in Raiders, all we need to know is that he needs to find the headpiece to the Staff of Ra and take it to the map room. That's the lead up to getting the Ark. In let's say Temple of Doom, he knows what the deal is with the children are being held at Pancot Palace and they got to find the stones. There's not too much of this lead up. In Last Crusade, he's got to find the knight's shield that'll fulfill the rest of the rubbing, and he gets the tablet completed, and he knows where to find the Holy Grail. It doesn't feel like it's rocket science, but when it comes to Crystal Skull and Dial of Destiny, it felt like it was a lot more convoluted. Where they had to go to Akator, and I don't know, they swept the floor and found more evidence on where to go, and I don't know. It just those kind of things is what was the drag on these because they have to, as it being an archaeologist and a treasure hunt movie, you have to be able to do these things where you follow the clues. I don't think that was as fun in the latter movies as it was in the original, but it was okay. I mean, at the end of the day, it wasn't any worse than Crystal Skull, and I found that to be, at least comforting, knowing that it was on par with Crystal Skull. Uh, Something else that I didn't like. Well, going back to what I said about how Indy was like, I felt like you really didn't get to see Indy really throw a punch too much. I think he might have thrown like two punches in the whole film. He got like one shootout scene. That was about it. I mean, in the older part, and I felt like he got punched way too many times. And I felt like, well, I don't really need you to prove to me that Indiana Jones can take a punch at 70. I need you to show me that Indiana Jones can throw a punch at 70. I wanted to be convinced that he was out there and he was taking no guff and he was throwing punches and hitting Nazis in the face. I I left the film more worrying about 70-year-old Indy getting punched in the face like 5 or 6 times in this film. I mean, like, flashing back to Last Crusade again, I mean, Henry gets, like, punched once, and everybody's like, "Oh, they're hitting Indy's dad," It was like, I remember feeling like, "Gee, that's terrible doing that to an old man," and he was like, what? Sean Connery was only, like, what, 60 or something at the time? But, here, Ford is literally 80, and he's, like, taking Nazis, punching him in the face 2 or 3 times in the film. 3 felt like it was more. Maybe it was only 2 or 3 times. And I'm like, "Come on, dude, let Indy punch somebody. Let him punch a dude in the face." You know what I mean? I believe a guy can throw a decent punch at 70. I could believe that. Again, Ford is 80, but the character's supposed to be 70 in this film. So that kind of disappointed me. So again, these things are all kind of leading up to a lackluster reception from me. And that's the problem. I'm just sitting there and I'm like, well, I'm hoping this next scene is really going to take off and Indy's going to take control. And no, he doesn't really. All right, he's going to let this guy have it now. And, no, he doesn't. All right, the main bad guy, he's going to really. The main bad guy does not get really defeated by Indiana Jones in this one. Now, I mean, arguably, like my brother said, arguably, none of the villains really get defeated by Indiana Jones. They always get defeated by the MacGuffin, with the slight exception being possibly Temple of Doom, because he knew the secret words to make the Shankara stones come alive, and Mola Ram is the one that grabs them, and that leads to his death. But really, but I felt like it was lacking that these villains were not dispatched by Indiana Jones. Now he shoots one guy. I think there was like one guy he actually shot. So he did shoot and kill some Nazi, but like for instance, the big guy that I was talking about. Now they have the sidekick kid, in shades of Short Round. Teddy, I think was his name, and he even says at one point to Helena that what is he taking over now? And that's kind of what it felt like. It was like for one or two brief moments, maybe Indiana Jones was going to take the lead, but he really doesn't get a chance to. It kind of feels like he's reacting more than, like I said, being proactive. But at one point, the big tough guy, the one that Pat Roach would have been playing, handcuffs himself to the kid, and the kid falls in the river with the big guy, and he gets out and he handcuffs the big guy to like a underwater grate, thus killing him. And I was saying to myself, I think Indiana Jones could have done that. I mean, all right, Indiana Jones cannot go toe to toe with whatever this guy was, a 30-year-old, 6'2", probably 280-pound guy. All right, you don't want him to do that. I'll go with you on that. But let him do something clever to defeat the bad guys. I don't feel like he got his chance to do anything clever to defeat the bad guys. I mean, when you've seen the original ones, a lot of clever stuff was done that, like I said, like Stapedo, he's stupid and he ended up getting speared because he didn't know about the light signal that would make the darts come out, or the spears. Something like that. You could have done something like that to show that Indy was smart enough that he didn't need to go toe to toe physically at this point in his life, but he was able to be smart enough to know what to do in the situation. That's the way I would have wrote it, I suppose, is what the problem was. I would have expected Indiana Jones that he could throw a punch or two. He could maybe jump from one tut tut or whatever they call those to the other. There wouldn't have been too much problem with that. And I feel like they took a lot of that away from him for the sake of, yes, he's older and Harrison Ford can't do all these things anymore. He could have probably did the same thing that kid did and managed to fall into the river with the guy, take the handcuffs off, and put the handcuffs on the fence or whatever that grate was down there below. So again, that was what was kind of disappointing to me. He doesn't really dispatch any of the bad guys. He doesn't really show any cleverness to, he was a smart guy that he could get out of situations. And I felt that they took that away from him. All right, let's try to briefly go over some of the characters. We get Sala back. All right, Sala was wonderful. I love John Rhys Davies. He's always wonderful in everything he does. But Sala is like his character. That's his baby. No matter what he plays, he played Gimli. He can play in Sliders. He did a lot of stuff. But to me, he'll always be Sala. And I loved having Sala back. So seeing him in the trailer really did my heart good. I knew that, give him hell, Indiana Jones. That was so good. And apparently, this is something that I really needed to know too, that he was taken care of. And he says at some point in the film, Indiana Jones moved his family out of Egypt after the war, and they became American citizens. He had like 8 or 9 kids. And I guess he's a taxi driver. I don't know if they made that very clear. I just remember seeing him get out of a taxi or get into a taxi. But, that he became an American and had a good life after that. That was fun. And he had grandchildren, which was fun too, because, he was surrounded by the kids, having so many kids. So now he had grandchildren that he was mentoring and telling them the legend of Indiana Jones and how that was all great. That was beautiful. That's what I mean. But about the whole film wasn't terrible. I mean, it wasn't bad. I'm just talking about the letdown parts, but there was a lot of parts that I really enjoyed. One of the things that was a letdown, I guess, was I would have loved to see him go with them on the adventure. Now, I was hoping that it wasn't going to be just a cameo, and in truth, it was more than a cameo, I guess. But I was hoping that he was going to go with them and maybe have as much of a role as he had in Last Crusade. Now, to be honest, in Last Crusade, he didn't have a huge part. He was in like the last act, and he helped save Indy's father, and he's in the Grail cave or whatever with Indy's father dying, but he really doesn't have like a huge role. Let's see if we can give him that kind of a role again, but they didn't. And that was sad, because I know in the trailer he says the whole line, I miss the adventure, I miss the sea and the desert and everything. And I was like, well, give him that adventure, let him have that moment. And again, he didn't have to be, but that's the thing. They gave a lot of the adventure stuff to Helena and I guess a little bit to Teddy. They didn't really want to give the old timers a lot to do. And it's sad because that's where we're at now with Indiana Jones. The whole cast is old and there's really not much you can do about it. And that's like the cards were dealt. And I really wish they could have played them a little bit more to the advantage of seeing more of the characters. What I would have loved, again, this is the way I would have done it. And I think that for some reason in the Indiana Jones movies, they're very hesitant for callbacks. Now, everybody was saying, get Short Round back in the movie because, he's young enough still. He would be, I don't know. I know in real life, I think Jonathan Kwan is um 50 something. He's 52, something like that. It would have been 50-ish about the time of the movie. And he's young enough to do stuff, especially when you figure out with Mutt dying, Indy really had Short Round as his first son. You know what I mean? I don't suppose he adopted him, kind of, because the way that he was never in any of the rest of these movies, you never see him really interact. I always, though, presumed that he was sort of his ward and that he sort of saw to it that he had an education and set up in some business or something, sort of the way we're told he did with Sala, that he helped him, transplant over to America with his family. And it would have been nice to have, like, especially with Mutt's passing, that we could have him sort of be the surrogate. But again, I felt like what they did with Helena or Helena, whatever you pronounce it, was they wanted to make her, they were wishing that Indy had a daughter and they could have, put her in that place, I think. And when they decided to make Indy have a son, that's the whole reason why Mutt is dead, because if they had the daughter, they probably could have done something with that story and made this his daughter, but they didn't. They went with an actual male character, so that kind of threw them. And of course, I would have had a cameo, especially back in the last movie. But I think, I mean, like I said, I remember John Reese Davies said he didn't want to be in Crystal Skull because they only wanted him to be at the wedding, and he wanted to have a more substantial role. I guess this is his more substantial role. But I would have had Willie Scott. I would have had Willie Scott show up. They're in that what was it, like a nightclub in Tangiers or something. Let her be with like some rich guy that was her husband, that she finally, married a rich guy, and he's owns the club there and Tangiers or whatever it is. That would have been great. And we see Willie and interact with old Indy. Give us the one adventure where he runs into all his old pals and all his old mates. I was thinking that about Ronaldo with Antonio Banderas. Maybe it could have been Katanga. I think that actor's still alive. I think the last movie I remember seeing him in was one of the Harry Potter films, right? He's probably still acting. Get him, and we could have had Katanga on that ship, and he would, of course, he would have been killed. That's probably the one of the things I would not like to see. But see, they could have changed a lot of this film because, like I said, a lot of this film is basically Indy getting captured by the bad guys. I think they wanted to make it sort of a race like it was in Raiders, like we're trying to outrace the other guys, but it didn't feel like it was equal. It felt like he was always getting captured and he just barely escaped. But yeah, you could have used Katanga. Who else? Was there anybody else they could have used? I don't know. But anyway, that's kind of the way I probably would have done it, and would have been fun. And of course, Marion comes back at the end, and it was so great to see Karen Allen again because they really should have had her all the way through in this one. But again, they just didn't want to have like three really, I mean, Karen Allen's not as old as Ford. She's like what, 70, something like that. They didn't really want to have, I guess, three aged actors being the stars of this. And that was what I wanted. And I think that's another thing that kind of disappointed me. But I was glad to see that they brought Marion back and he wound up with Marion again, and he's gonna, live out the end of his days with his first love. And Sala comes in at the end and he's got the kids, and that was a really great ending considering what we had seen. You know what I mean? I would have preferred that he went back in time and got Mutt saved and this and that. But I mean, considering again, let's talk about that ending. So the ending has him going back to Rome at I don't remember what he said. What was it, 12 BC or something? I can't remember. But at the time of Archimedes, Archimedes being a real figure had created this thing, and I think in real life this Dial of Destiny is based on something real that he created. And I didn't have a problem with this. I mean, the setup was very threadbare. It was like I said, it was like Indiana Jones is getting captured again for like the third time in the movie or something. Helena Shaw has to race to the airplane and get him, and all this felt very much like Captain America. I could feel like Disney breathing down the neck of the writers. Like, this was in Captain America. Do this. Because she has to get into the plane the same way Captain America did on the landing gear. And she gets in there. And of course, Voller, his plan is the same as the Red Skull. He is not beholden to Hitler. I mean, he wants to get rid of Hitler the same way the Red Skull did. And he wants to do the Nazi regime better. So it's almost like the Red Skull's plan all over again. Something else that my brother said too that was really on point was I'm glad they didn't wimp out because I expected fully that they were going to wimp out. I didn't think they were going to show any swastikas. I didn't think they were going to show, you know, the big Nazi strongholds. You know, everything is so touchy feely and politically correct in this day and age. You can't do any of that stuff. But, you know, and it's so stupid too because I mean, everybody accepts that the Nazis are bad guys. You know what I mean? Nobody wants to see the Nazis win. Nobody has a positive thing to say about the Nazis. So when they're showing the Nazi flag and they're showing all that stuff in Raiders and to some extent in this movie at the beginning, it you know, it makes the picture feel authentic when you do that because that's what Indy was up against, you know? So again, going back to the end, it feels like, you know, they had the kid know how to fly a plane just for the purpose of flying the plane at the end. And they even had to make sure that the guy was taking a nap in his plane, the plane that he stole, because it was going to get pretty far fetched that, you know, they were going to ever get back to the present. I didn't think that this plot was too far fetched because considering what we have in the indie films, I mean, for instance, you know, the Crystal Skull, it was aliens, and you know, nobody liked that, but that you got to remember that was part of the saga now. I mean, that the Grail Knight could, you know, live forever, you know, arguably, so long as he didn't leave the chamber, I guess. You know, I mean, that's the rules. And I feel like they did a similar thing here. Whereas you could always use the Dial of Destiny, but only to go back to that point where Archimedes made it, where he created it. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, I didn't like the ending because, again, I mean, I wasn't thrilled with the way that it went out. I wasn't crazy about how the villains died, like I said, without too much flourish. I mean, you expect a real bad finish for the bad guys in this franchise. Doesn't necessarily have to be gory, but I mean, I think Helena shoots Voller, and the other guy just gets speared or something. I can't even remember how he dies, and then they crash and burn. And again, it's kind of anticlimactic. I mean, Indy should have had something to do with that downfall. The only thing that they let him do was, of course, kill the guy that was going to kill Helena, and so by proxy, he saves the day. But I want my Indiana Jones to do more, and I didn't like that he wanted to stay for two reasons. One, when you're talking about time travel, you have to understand that you're probably going to ruin something in the future by doing something in the past. Now, this version of time travel is, I like this version the best because it's like set in stone. It already happened. Now, when they found Archimedes' bones, remains, whatever, he had the watch on that was Voller's. So you know that he went, and they show the tomb had carvings of the propellers and stuff. So you know that he'd already been, they let you think he went to the future, but the past has already happened, and this has already happened that Voller has been to the past. Kind of confusing to explain, but it's one of those things where it's already happened and it can't be undone. So on the one hand, I get the idea that Indy wanted to be able to, hang around in the past because his whole life revolves around the artifacts of the past. And in a way, I think that could have been played better because if you wanted to have that moment where Indy is like, he meets Archimedes and he wants to be able to study something, there's really nothing for him to study there. They're in the middle of a war and he's bleeding out from the shoulder, so he's not going to live much longer anyway. So say they leave without him, all he's going to do is keel over and die in like 15 minutes. And so that, to me, it didn't make any sense. And I get it. It's the whole thing. He's depressed, he's disappointed, and he's just going to die there. But it's like that to me is not Indiana Jones. I don't think he would also, apart from screwing up the time continuum or whatever, I don't think he would want to just stay there to die. To me, that doesn't seem to ring true for a survivor like Indiana Jones. So basically, at the end of the day, I don't have a problem with the way it was resolved because you know I, if they ended it like that, I would have hated this movie. I'll just tell you right off, I would have hated it. But the fact that Helena brings him back and punches him in the face and brings him back, and that Marion is with him at the end, I think that sort of redeems the picture. I think that kind of is what brought me out of it. But essentially, they basically gave Indiana Jones the same script as Han Solo. Basically, literally at one point in the movie, he says the same thing Han Solo says. She doesn't want to talk to me because Sala was telling him, "Why don't you call Marion and maybe we can figure this out." It's the exact same thing. Indy slash Han loses his son. The wife is resentful and disconsolate and can't carry on with him anymore. And he goes off and continues to do his own thing. It's basically the same story. That's why I think a lot of people have problems with this, is because there's no originality to the old, sad, depressed hero that can't quite move on and ascend to a happy ending. Back in the day, we all were brought up on happy endings. They lived happily ever after. But it seems like in this current age, we're not allowed to have that. But that's why I said in this case, at least we got that happy ending. And I thought it was cute. They brought back the whole scene, which is probably one of my favorite romantic scenes in any movie, which is, it's very subtle. It's like, where doesn't it hurt? And he's like, here. And she does that back to him. It also reminded me of like Return of the Jedi when he says "I love you" when Princess Leia says "I know." It's kind of the callback in reverse. You know what I mean? And Jedi is one of my favorite movies, so I felt on that level it really worked, and so that was really nice. Uh, is there anything else I haven't touched upon? Again, like I said, I think the ending sort of redeemed it for me, but there was a lot of stuff in the middle from like the second act that I was really wishing they could have tightened up and worked better on. I liked seeing him in the casino auction scene or whatever. I thought that was very clever because he looked a lot like Indiana Jones in that. He had the tie on, like in from Last Crusade, and he's using the whip. It's like one of the few times he uses it in the film. So that scene was great as well. And like I said, I thought the chase scene after that was pretty good. They had him underwater, which I thought was really good. They had the electric eels, which I thought was really cool because that's the closest thing they came to was with snakes. I mean, they didn't want to just all out bring snakes back into it, but underwater snakes are eels basically. And I thought it was cool that he was underwater because with the technology advancing, you got to remember back in the 40s, or because he was at his peak in the 30s, they wouldn't have had the kind of technology to go underwater to do archaeological excavation underwater. They would have wore the big bell suit. You know how that is. Would have been really tough. And to see Indiana Jones actually going underwater and doing an archaeological expedition type thing there, that was really fun. And I think that was something that they took advantage of, the period that he could do that in the 60s, close to 70. and have it, be something we haven't seen before that Indiana Jones would do. And that's why I say I think they could have had him do more, because that was like a scene that shows they could have done something that Indiana Jones hasn't done before. So, coming up to an hour, and while my voice still holds out, let me give this a ranking, a rating. Like I said, I think this one is the least of the films. I want to say it's 2.5 stars out of 5. That's kind of where I'm feeling right now. Maybe it'll grow on me a little more, and I'll be able to give it a 3. But right now, 2.5 stars out of 5. I'm going to give it a C minus. A C minus. It's still holding on to a C. I wouldn't say it's a D. I wouldn't say it's a complete failure. So I'm going to say C minus. But again, it's about as good as I could have expected it without Lucas and Spielberg. So let me know what you think in the comments below. What did you think about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny? And until next we meet, this is Johnny Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.